Come now to the 10-minute rule motion. Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring a bill to promote awareness of abuse of elderly people and adults at risk, to promote training, to promote greater awareness and understanding of the rights of victims of abuse, to promote the development of local strategies for preventing abuse, and for ensuring that victims are assisted in recovering from the effects of abuse. I am delighted to have the opportunity to introduce this motion, Mr. Speaker, and present my bill today. The issue of abuse of elderly people and adults at risk is very much a hidden problem, and I hope that by raising this issue in the House today, I will help to focus attention on a matter which affects hundreds of thousands of people every year, and which a range of organisations, including Age UK, the Alzheimer's Society, and many others, have already done so much to highlight. Issues of abuse are, of course, complex, and much abuse goes unreported. The failure by abused elderly people and adults generally to report instances of abuse is due to a number of reasons: stigma, shame, even a feeling of guilt by the abused, wrongly but genuinely felt, for having provoked the abuse. Very often, the abused adult is dependent on the abuser. Isolation plays a part, as does lack of contact with care providers or criminal justice agencies. And the complexity of the problem is illustrated by the result of a piece of work carried out recently in Northern Ireland, which showed that 3/4 of incidents where elderly adults were subjected to abuse involved a family member, including very close relatives. And often the abused person in this kind of situation will want to maintain still some kind of relationship with the abuser, or may be threatened that if they report the abuse, they will be denied access to other family members, such as grandchildren, reinforcing feelings of loneliness and isolation. And in such cases, the elderly person often decides to balance the abuse that they are actually suffering against the fear of some future action which they believe would see them left in an even worse state than they are currently. As a country, Mr. Speaker, we must do everything we can to protect people at risk, especially our senior citizens, from a range of abuse, which can take many different forms, and often these factors are combined. But generally, abuse falls into the following categories: emotional, psychological, financial abuse, physical, sexual and neglect. And whilst we, honourable members, will all have come across or will be aware of some extreme examples of abuse when it's reported in the press and media, it's clear that there are many examples where abuse can happen almost unnoticed, or is passed off and excused as poor care, or that's just the way he or she, a family member, behaves. Now, one area which is causing more and more concern is the area of financial abuse. A Help the Aged report in 2008 into financial abuse indicated that up to 2.5% of all elderly people felt that they had experienced some kind of financial abuse, exploitation or coercion. And I know that from my constituency casework, I come across more and more specific issues surrounding the administration of the personal finances of vulnerable adults. And this is becoming a greater problem given the difficult economic times we are facing and pressures on family finances. Yet the fact is that public awareness of this general issue is limited. Many members of the public at large do not understand the nature of the different types of abuse. Again, this was borne out by the work of a partnership project in Northern Ireland, Uniting Against Elder Abuse, which brought together the then Age Concern Help the Aged, of course now united as Age Northern Ireland, the Alzheimer's Society and Carers Northern Ireland. And that project delivered a 2-year strategic programme aimed at raising awareness of the problem generally, provided access to independent advocacy for frail older people and those with dementia, and developed a therapeutic response for those who experienced abuse. And people genuinely in Northern Ireland, certainly I can speak from the experience that we had then, were taken aback at the report's findings and the extent of the problem, because the number of people affected is much greater than is sometimes realised. It's estimated that 1 in 25 of all older people living in the community are affected by some kind of abuse every single year. And because the majority of cases occur in the older person's home, other agencies, such as social services, are not necessarily involved or aware. According to one survey, 62% reported that they had no contact whatsoever with social services or any other support organisation, highlighting the fact that there is likely to be a major hidden minority of older people living in an abusive situation or subject to some kind of abuse without recourse to traditional forms of support or help. So there must be, Mr. Speaker, greater commitment to educating and informing people about the support available to them. There are gaps in education, knowledge and training at both individual level and across the public and voluntary sectors, and that must be plugged. It is vital that we have a single common piece of legislation to reinforce existing policies designed to protect the elderly and adults at risk of abuse. Current safeguarding legislation is too complex, it is spread across many various acts and measures, and it offers therefore only limited protection. No single professional, whether it be a social worker, police officer or nurse, could ever be expected to be aware of all the legislation which is out there. And that is why overarching, comprehensive and consolidating legislation is needed. There would be immense benefit in bringing existing provisions together, including principles, definitions, a duty to investigate, clarification of powers of entry, powers to remove a perpetrator or perpetrators of abuse, and a duty of cooperation. And legislation should not just be about responding to individual allegations of abuse. It should place a strong emphasis on prevention, not just about preventing an abusive situation arising for an individual. What's needed is a major shift towards understanding the circumstances and situations which contribute towards abuse or render people vulnerable to abuse, acknowledging the reality of its effect and how we as a society must move towards eradicating it. Mr. Speaker, often there appears to be little formal contact between agencies and services, and support can be uncoordinated and fragmented. And we compare that to the situation regarding the protection of children, and a benchmark which we should seek to emulate. There is too much buck passing when it comes to vulnerable adults or senior citizens. And in my view, only legislation will end it. Legislation would require suspected abuse to be investigated. Guidance is all well and good, but it applies differently to the various authorities and statutory agencies. The law would apply to all agencies involved in preventing and responding to abuse. Specific legislation would force better coordination of the various statutory agencies as they confront the silent offender of abuse. And the same legislation could address the training and education deficit, which I have already talked about, across the range of elderly support services, including the private, public and voluntary sectors. Now, devolved administrations are already taking steps or have taken steps to target elder abuse. Scotland introduced the Adult Support and Protection Scotland Act in 2007. Wales is preparing to make recommendations by the end of this year, it is hoped, and Northern Ireland is preparing a policy framework for consultation in early 2011. The Department of Health opened up consultation on the No Secrets guidance in 2009, but to date the previous government, now this one, and I know it is only in place a short time, but there has been no government response to the findings of that consultation, including on the issue of whether legislation is needed. In my view, Mr. Speaker, legislation on the abuse of elderly people and adults at risk would facilitate a more comprehensive assessment with a common benchmark standard across all support agencies. It would establish a more consistent and effective response by statutory providers. It would ensure better training and education, which would improve levels of awareness, and it would consolidate current local authority guidelines and offer enhanced guidance to the criminal justice system. Mr. Speaker, the day we set aside or neglect our responsibility to help and cater for the needs of our senior citizens and those who are open and at risk of abuse within our society is the day that we lose our moral compass. I believe this is an extremely important issue, and I hope that today's motion and presentation of this bill will lead to some action on the part of government. I commend this motion and bill to the House.
The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in his bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Mr Andrew Percy, Mr Malcolm Wicks, Mr Greg Mulholland, Dr William McRae, Mr Geoffrey Donaldson, Mr Gregory Campbell, Sammy Wilson, David Simpson, Ian Paisley, Jim Shannon and myself, sir.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Support and protection for elderly people and adults at risk of abuse bill.
Second reading what day?
17th of June 2011.
17th of June 2011. We come